David Gilmour. There are legends, and then there are those rare souls whose music becomes the very air we breathe, whose pain and triumph echo through generations. David Gilmour is one of those rare souls. To speak his name is to conjure the sound of a single, aching note suspended in time, a note that can hush a stadium or bring a solitary listener to tears. But behind the myth, behind the soaring solos and the thunderous applause, lies a story so human, so fragile, that it almost hurts to tell. At 79, David Gilmour stands as a living monument to both the beauty and the brutality of life. His journey is not just one of musical genius, but of wounds that never fully healed, of friendships lost to madness and death, of love found and lost and found again, and of a silence that has haunted him since childhood. It's easy to see only the legend. The man with the black Stratocaster, the architect of Pink Floyd's most transcendent moments, the voice that gave us Comfortably Numb, Wish You Were Here, and Shine on You Crazy Diamond. But to understand the tragedy of David Gilmour, you have to look beyond the stage lights, beyond the platinum records and the sold-out tours. You have to see the boy who grew up in a house where words were few and warmth was rarer still. The young man who watched his closest friend slip away into the shadows of mental illness. The artist who poured his grief and guilt into music that would outlive them all. David Gilmour was born in Cambridge, England, in 1946 into a world that seemed, on the surface, to offer every advantage. His father was a respected academic, his mother a teacher and later a film editor. Their home was filled with books and conversation, but for young David, it was a place of quiet isolation. He would later describe his childhood not as one of chaos or violence, but of a cold, unyielding silence. A silence that left scars deeper than any wound. It was in this silence that he first found music, not as a hobby, but as a lifeline. At 10, his mother gave him a guitar, perhaps not realizing she was handing him the only voice he would ever truly trust. While other children played and laughed, David retreated into his room, hunched over his guitar, teaching himself to coax emotion from the strings. Each note was a word he couldn't say, each chord a plea for connection. By his early teens, he was already wrestling with questions of mortality and meaning, haunted by the brevity of life and the weight of unspoken pain. At school, he was quiet, withdrawn, more interested in music than in marks or popularity. It was here, in the muted corridors of Cambridge, that he met Syd Barrett and Roger Waters, names that would one day become legend, but who were, at the time, just fellow outsiders searching for something they couldn't name. The seeds of Pink Floyd were planted in those years, but for David, music was never about fame or fortune. It was about survival. It was about turning emptiness into beauty, loneliness into sound. When he played, it was as if he was building cathedrals out of thin air, sanctuaries where grief and hope could coexist. But even as his talent grew, so did the shadows. The world would come to know David Gilmour as the quiet genius behind some of rock's most iconic moments, but few would ever see the wounds that drove him, the wounds that, even now at 79, have never fully healed. As the years passed, the silence of his childhood gave way to the chaos of the music world. The road to success was anything but smooth. There were years of struggle, of playing in small bands, of drifting through Europe with little more than a guitar and a dream. There were nights when hunger was a more constant companion than hope, when the only way to eat was to pawn the very instrument that carried his soul. But through it all, David endured. He turned every setback into a lesson, every heartbreak into a song. And when fate finally called him to join Pink Floyd, it was not as a conquering hero, but as a friend stepping into the void left by another's collapse. The moment David Gilmour joined Pink Floyd, the band was teetering on the edge of oblivion. Syd Barrett, the group's original visionary, was unraveling before their eyes, his mind slipping away under the weight of unchecked genius and the ravages of mental illness. For David, stepping into the band was not a triumph, but a heartbreak. He was not replacing a musician. He was witnessing the slow disappearance of a friend. The world saw a new guitarist, but David saw a tragedy unfolding in real time, a tragedy that would haunt him for decades. The decision to leave Syd behind was made quietly, almost cruelly, on the way to a gig. They simply stopped picking him up. That night, David became the lead guitarist of Pink Floyd, but he also became the keeper of a wound that would never fully close. The early years with Pink Floyd were marked by uncertainty and survival. The band was adrift, their identity fractured by the loss of their founding member. David often played with his back to the audience, unsure if the music still made sense without Syd's guiding light. Their first album without him, A Saucerful of Secrets, was less a declaration of purpose than a desperate attempt to keep moving forward. They took on film soundtracks, obscure projects, anything to stay afloat. In these sessions, David began to shape his signature sound: the long, aching bends, the infinite sustain, the sense that every note was a cry from the soul. It was in this crucible of uncertainty that the true voice of David Gilmour began to emerge. Then, almost miraculously, the band found its footing. With the release of Metal and its epic centerpiece, Accuse, Pink Floyd began to coalesce into something new. The opening ping of David's guitar cut through the darkness like a beacon, guiding the band and their audience toward a new identity. For the first time since Syd's departure, Pink Floyd had a heartbeat again, and that heartbeat was David's guitar. The years of hunger, guilt, and self-doubt had forged a musician capable of turning pain into transcendence. But even as the band soared to new heights, the ghosts of the past lingered. Every success was shadowed by the memory of what had been lost. The 1970s were a time of both triumph and torment. With The Dark Side of the Moon, Pink Floyd became a global phenomenon. The album's success was staggering. 15 years on the charts, tens of millions of copies sold, a sound that defined a generation. David's voice soared through Breathe. His solos carved eternity into time. His guitar lines entwined with Claire Torrey's Wail On, The Great Gig in the Sky. But for David, the music was never just about spectacle. It was about channeling the inexpressible, about giving voice to the grief and longing that had shaped his life. Wish You Were Here was not just a song. It was a funeral mass for Syd Barrett, a lament for a friend lost to the shadows. David would later admit that singing it was almost unbearable, each word a reminder of genius destroyed and futures stolen by addiction and illness. As the band's fame grew, so did the fractures within. The making of Animals and The Wall was marked by conflict and betrayal. Roger Waters' lyrics dripped with rage, while David's guitar clawed for humanity. In the studio, Comfortably Numb became a battleground. Waters demanding orchestral despair, David answering with fire. The result was one of the greatest solos ever recorded, but the cost was immense. Rick Wright, David's quiet brother-in-arms, was cast out, reduced to a hired hand. The soul of the band was slipping away, and even at the height of their success, David felt the music losing its meaning. The final cut was humiliation. David reduced to a session player in his own band, his voice muted, his presence erased. When Roger Waters finally quit Pink Floyd and declared the band finished, it was as if 2 decades of David Gilmour's life had been erased overnight. Headlines echoed Waters' claim, and for a moment, It seemed the world would accept that the story was over. But David refused to disappear. He returned to the studio, not with bombast or bitterness, but with a quiet determination that had always defined him. He let his guitar speak where words could not, and from that silence rose a momentary lapse of reason. Critics doubted, but stadiums filled. The music, now shaped by David's vision, carried a new sense of resilience, a refusal to let the past dictate the future. 7 years later, The Division Bell arrived, its themes of reconciliation and right restored echoing through every note. The tour was a triumph, grossing hundreds of millions, and the live album, Pulse, immortalized the band's power. At last, the shadow of being just the replacement began to lift. Pink Floyd was not one man, it was David Gilmour too. Yet even in triumph, mortality could not be silenced. In 2005, the classic four, Gilmour, Waters, Wright, and Mason, stood together one last time at Live 8. Their performance of Comfortably Numb was more than a song. It was a resurrection, a fleeting moment when old wounds seemed to heal and time itself offered forgiveness. The roar of the crowd was thunderous, but behind David's eyes there was a shadow, as if he knew the miracle could never last. 3 years later, that fear became reality. Rick Wright, his quiet anchor and brother in harmony, was gone, claimed by cancer at just 65. For David, it was the cruelest symmetry. Sid lost to madness, Rick lost to death, and the band they had built together reduced to photographs, recordings, and ghosts. The endless river of music they had created now felt like a requiem, a final breath of a brotherhood that could never be reborn. After Rick's passing, David turned inward. His solo work no longer sought spectacle, but honesty. On an Island, released in 2006 with lyrics by his wife Polly Sampson, revealed a man at peace with both pain and beauty. The album was intimate, reflective, a quiet triumph of survival. Rattle That Lock, released in 2015, carried the voice of someone who had weathered every storm and emerged, if not unscathed, then unbroken. When David returned to Pompeii, where he had once stood as a young man with Pink Floyd, it was alone, just himself and his guitar, closing the circle with grace. The arc of his career is both triumphant and tragic. Stadiums roared with his sound, yet silence stalked him home. Betrayal scarred him, but he played on. Friends were lost, but he carried their voices through his strings. He turned hunger into resilience, guilt into compassion, and loss into eternal music. But the tragedies of David Gilmour's life were not confined to the stage. The collapse of his own home mirrored the fractures within Pink Floyd. At the very moment when the band he had helped keep alive was tearing itself apart, his marriage, the one place that should have been safe, began to unravel. In 1975, at the height of Floyd's success, David married Virginia Ginger Hasenbean, a striking American model and artist. Their early years were filled with hope and laughter, a young couple standing at the edge of a future that seemed limitless. For David, who had grown up in a house where love was often muted, marriage promised a chance to build a warmer kind of home, to give his children the presents he had longed for as a boy. 4 children followed, filling the house with the noise and chaos of life. But as the 1980s wore on, the strain of a life lived under constant pressure began to seep into every corner of his existence. The world saw David Gilmour as a rock icon, but at home, the absences grew longer, the silences deeper. Nights stretched into weeks, weeks into months. Ginger, once radiant at his side, grew wary of living in the shadow of a man who belonged as much to millions as he did to her. The children, still young, often asked why their father was gone so much, questions that stung more deeply than any critic's review. David would later admit, with the quiet regret of someone who rarely exposed his wounds, that he was watching his marriage dissolve at the same time the band was breaking apart. I don't think I realized until it was too late how much damage was being done. He reflected. The divorce in 1990 was not loud or scandalous, but to David, it felt like a private earthquake. He had been the man who could hold an arena with a single note, yet he could not hold his own family together. Friends recall him walking into the studio, in those years looking hollowed out, carrying his guitar like a burden rather than a gift. The children stayed primarily with Ginger, though David remained present in their lives. For him, the hardest wound was not only the absence of a partner, but the distance from the everyday chaos of fatherhood. The laughter at the dinner table, the bedtime stories, the simple joy of being there. Ginger, in later years, would say quietly, "We were young, we loved each other, but the world around us was too loud, too consuming. In the end, it drowned us." It was a loss David rarely spoke of except in fragments. The 4 children they shared remained his pride. But the shadow of that broken marriage followed him long after the papers were signed. For a man whose music had always been born from wounds, this was another scar carved not by a bandmate or a critic, but by the collapse of the one place he had hoped to find peace. Yet out of the ruins of loss, sometimes light finds its way in. For David Gilmour, that light appeared in the early 1990s when he met Polly Sampson, a novelist and journalist whose pen carried both tenderness and fire. Where his first marriage had collapsed under the weight of distance and silence, Polly arrived as both anchor and spark. She was not only a companion but a collaborator. Someone who spoke the same language of art, and who seemed to understand that David's music was less profession than survival. With Polly, he would later reflect, "I found not only love but honesty. She gave me the words when I had none." They married in 1994, in the shadow of both personal wounds and professional battles. To the world, Pink Floyd was still a titan preparing the release of The Division Bell. But behind the music was something more intimate. Polly's words flowing into David's melodies. Their creative bond becoming the scaffolding for both the album and their life together. Songs like High Hopeets carried her lyrical touch, and though listeners heard echoes of grandeur and regret, for David those lines were something else. A private message from his wife woven into the fabric of Pink Floyd's sound. It was a rare moment when the public and private aligned, when the music was both confession and communion. Their home soon filled with the warmth of children. Together they had 4, adding to the 4 from David's first marriage, making a blended family of 8. The house, once quiet after the fracture of divorce, now echoed with the sounds of laughter, footsteps, arguments, and the endless rhythm of everyday life. For a man who had once come home to cold silence, this was a resurrection. Friends who visited recalled David in those years, not as the haunted figure bent over a guitar, but as a father sitting on the floor surrounded by toys, or a husband strumming softly, while Polly scribbled lines on a notepad nearby. It was domesticity, yes, but also alchemy, the transformation of pain into partnership, of solitude into shared creation. Polly herself has spoken of their bond with equal candor. "I never felt I was stepping into a legend's shadow," she once said. "I was stepping into a life, and it was a life we were building together." For David, that life was not without its lingering ghosts, the wounds of his past marriage, the absences of his children who lived primarily with Ginger. But Polly gave him a place where those ghosts could be acknowledged without consuming him. She became both mirror and refuge, someone who reminded him that even great artists were still men who needed home, warmth, and forgiveness. As the years passed, their creative partnership deepened. Polly wrote lyrics for David's solo albums, including On an Island, which topped the UK charts not with bombast, but with intimacy. Those songs spoke of peace, reflection, and the quiet triumph of survival, words that carried her voice as much as his guitar. Later, Rattle That Lock revealed a freer David Gilmour, still searching, but no longer broken. His music was infused with the steady presence of a partner who had walked with him through every storm. What makes their story extraordinary is not just the music they made, but the life they built. After decades defined by chaos, addiction around him, and broken ties, David found in Polly a rare gift, a second chance. Not perfection, not escape, but balance. The man who once watched his family fall apart in silence now found himself part of a home where words flowed, songs healed, and love endured. For David Gilmour, Polly Samson was more than a wife. She was proof that even after the harshest storms, there can still be music, and there can still be light. Now at 79, David Gilmour lives not in the glare of celebrity, but in the quiet company of family. He shares his days with Polly Samson, his wife since 1994, and the partner who has written the words to many of his most intimate songs. Together, they raised a blended family of 8 children, 4 from his first marriage, 4 from theirs. And though the children are now grown, their presence still orbits his life. Some, like Romany and Gabriel, have even stepped onto stage with him, weaving their voices into his music. Home for David is no longer a stage, but a circle of loved ones where grandchildren play and evenings are spent in Sussex, or aboard the Astoria with Polly nearby and the river stretching beyond the windows. His fortune, estimated at well over $180 million, has never shaped him into the caricature of a rock star drowning in excess. His treasures were never Hollywood mansions or limousines, lined up in marble garages, but places where music could breathe and where silence could be turned into song. In 1986, he bought the Astoria, a Victorian wooden houseboat moored permanently on the River Thames, and transformed it into one of the most iconic recording studios on Earth. Its glass walls overlook the river, while inside, albums were born, A Momentary Lapse of Reason, The Division Bell, and many of his solo works. To this day, the Astoria is not just property, it is a floating cathedral of sound. In Sussex, he poured his soul into restoring Medina House, an 8,000 square foot mansion on the Hove seafront. Once valued at $15 million, later listed for $10 million, and most recently revalued near $9 million after legal disputes. The property was less a trophy than a retreat, a place where sea winds drifted through open windows, and music seemed to ride the horizon. Beyond England, he once kept a villa in Greece, listed at $1.5 million, where Mediterranean sunlight painted his days with rare peace. On land, his passions roared with engines. He owned an enviable collection of Ferraris, none more famous than the 1988 Ferrari F40 he collected with Nick Mason from the Fiorano test track. The two friends drove it back across Europe themselves, a rock star and a drummer racing down highways like boys. But if cars were a passion, the sky was a calling. Through his company, Intrepid Aviation, David Gilmour amassed and restored a fleet of historic aircraft, P-51 Mustangs, Beech Staggerwings, Boeing Stearmans, Yak 50s, and even a rare SNJ-70C. His planes appeared in over 80 film and television productions, including Band of Brothers. To him, these machines were not indulgences, but living history, restored with the same reverence he gave to his guitars. Artifacts meant to be heard, seen, and felt again. And yet, for all this wealth, Gilmour never became its prisoner. In 2003, he sold his little Venice mansion for $3.6 million, giving every penny to Crisis, the charity for the homeless. In 2019, he let go of 120 of his guitars, including the black strat, the very instrument that gave the world, comfortably numbed, and shine on you crazy diamond. It sold for nearly $4 million, the centerpiece of an auction that raised a $21.5 million, all of which he donated to Client Hearth. Even smaller gestures spoke volumes, a $25,000 to save the rhino in honor of Douglas Adams, who suggested the title, The Division Bell. His message was clear. Property, cars, planes, even guitars, all were transient. What mattered was what could be given back. My guitars served me well, he said softly. But it's time for them to serve the planet. He still plays, still sings, still tours. His hair is white, his steps slower. But when his fingers touch the strings, time itself seems to hesitate. A single note stretches into the air like breath held between life and death. Fragile, infinite, unbroken. He lives quietly now, walking the windswept Sussex coast, tending the garden with the same patience he once gave to a melody, recording in the Astoria as the river murmurs outside. His face may be weathered, but the sound has not aged. Time can silver the body, but it cannot silence the soul. And yet, what surrounds him now is not only silence, but a fragile kind of symphony, with Polly Sampson, his wife, his muse, his anchor. He has built a life where love itself becomes collaboration. She writes words. He breathes them into sound. Their children join in, Romany's voice trembling through, between 2 points. Gabriel and Charlie adding their own notes, so that their home is no longer just walls, but a living orchestra. Luck and Strange, his 2024 album, was not an album in the usual sense, but a family portrait painted in chords and verses, a reminder that sometimes art's truest power lies not in spectacle, but in belonging. On stage, from Rome's Circus Maximus to New York and Los Angeles, he no longer stands alone. He stands inside a circle of blood, bond, and memory. But shadows never release their hold. When he turns to the side, only one of the old guard remains. Nick Mason steady on the drums, not a rival, never a foe, but now a mirror of all that has been lost. Syd Barrett, his childhood friend, gone to madness. Rick Wright, his quiet brother, gone to cancer at 65. Waters, estranged, divided by wounds no song could heal. What was once a quartet is now a duet. Every smile shared with Mason carries the weight of absence. Every rehearsal echoes louder because of those no longer there. Even the laughter of their Ferrari road trip in 1988 feels today like a ghost chasing them down empty highways. The joy is real, but so is the silence. This is the paradox of David Gilmour's Twilight. Wealth vast enough to last lifetimes, yet meaning little. Family filling the space once held by roaring crowds, yet always shadowed by those missing from the table. His legacy cannot be counted in sales or stadium lights. It lives in what his guitar has done for us all, turning silence into speech, grief into beauty, mortality into memory. He is proof that the greatest heroes do not need to shout. They bend a single note until the whole world falls still, listening. If David Gilmour has ever made you stop, close your eyes, and feel something you could never name, share it below. Did you first meet him in The Dark Side of the Moon, in Wish You Were Here, in The Division Bell, or was it a single solo that still lingers with you today? Leave a like, leave a tribute, and let us carry his music further into the silence, into the light, into every heart it can still reach.